Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout who likes to think of herself as a corporate innovator, and I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck. Admittedly, it often does. By some stats, up to 80% of the workforce are unsatisfied, disengaged at work. And on the flip side here, folks are expecting more and more that work is going to fulfill fundamental needs around satisfaction and purpose in their lives. Folks are basing their identity around their roles at work. And the pandemic and the Great Resignation, and now we're turning into the Great Regret. All of this has forced us to take a look at quality of life and what culture really means for people inside of organizations. In fact, I do think that business is cool. I think that building things and solving real world problems and the process of collaboration and creation, these are all fundamental to the best parts of the human experience. This is how we embrace human potential. In this episode, I'm talking about the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is known as the feel-good hormone. It gives you a sense of pleasure. It gives you the motivation to do something when you're feeling pleasure. Dopamine is part of your reward system. The system is designed from an evolutionary standpoint to reward you when you're doing the things that you need to survive, to eat, to drink, to compete, to survive and reproduce. As humans, our brains are hardwired to seek out behaviors that release dopamine in our reward system. When you're doing something pleasurable, your brain releases a large amount of dopamine, you feel good, and you seek more of that feeling. This is why junk food and sugar are so addictive. They trigger the release of large amounts of dopamine into your brain, which gives you the feeling that you are on top of the world and you want to repeat that experience. In this episode, I'm referencing the book Dopamine Nation quite a bit. It's by Anna Lembke. She's the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. And paraphrasing a little bit from the introduction to her book, the book is about pleasure and pain and how understanding the balance between these two is essential to a life well lived. She talks about how in not too many generations, we've transported from a life of scarcity to that of abundance. Everything from drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebooking, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting, the increase in numbers, variety, and potency of highly rewarding stimuli is staggering. It's said that the smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle, delivering dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. So in the episode, I'm linking themes around ideas of work dope to dopamine. I'm talking about implications around our expectations at work. How do we get through work that is the opposite of feel good? How do we get through work that's the opposite from feelings of euphoria? What are the implications here on our ability to connect with what matters, to prioritize worthy activities versus the opposite, seeking quick hit work activities or distractions over more challenging long-term projects? I give examples of how to pre-pave towards less reliance on quick hits for that afternoon slump or for managing workflows. And even the quick hits that sometimes come from bitching about your coworkers, or with your coworkers, I should say. And one of the main themes is leaning towards enrichment over quick hits and distracting activities. How do we suck the marrow out of life and work, engaging in ways that leave us lifted? Even if we're energy depleted, but lifted in a good way, a good type of energy drain, rather than leaving us spent, empty, pummeled, at worst, numb. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey there. So I've been interested in the effects of dopamine, the feel-good hormone in our human biological systems for a lot of years, although maybe I didn't know all those years what I was interested in terms of it being a neurotransmitter. I've read stories about Ritalin being used to help students cram for exam season. And Ritalin is one of many prescription stimulants that are basically molecular equivalents to street methamphetamine. They cause a surge of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway and have a very high potential for abuse. And that is quoted from the Food and Drug Administration. For me, it was candy. I would use candy in college to get myself through exam period. Dopamine helps with focus, and I could focus really well when there was a constant flow of sugar in my veins. So what did this mean? It meant going to the on-campus store and like getting a variety of things from those bins that you could pick from. And I would slowly consume things that were chewy or, full of sugar, like those sour gummies and things like that. And it really did help me focus, especially during my later years in college. And then in my work life, long office days, there was a period of time when I was using, if you will, caffeinated diet soda. I felt like this would turn off some kind of inner restlessness in me. And I hope to learn about this more. I've been reading a lot about this in a book that's recently come out called Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. So she really looks at dopamine and the effects of dopamine in our systems, and she studies addicts of all sorts. She's a researcher at Stanford, so I'll talk more about the book as I go. But this is really curious to me, and I'm really curious to where it intersects with work. Today, in our modern world, we are saturated with dopamine release events, if you will, by media and marketing. The professionals know really well how our brains are wired for quick fixes. In fact, in lab research, it's shown that dopamine is the motivation neurotransmitter, right? It's the thing that moves us to get a reward. It's really what motivates us to do just about anything. There's this promise of the reward of dopamine. In studies where mice have easy access to food, when dopamine was eliminated from their systems, they didn't eat the food, even though it was right in front of them. There is definitely something about the approach or the effect of the reward and being able to go after something that really stimulates us to get us to do it. Ultimately, the body will balance itself. So once we've had a rush from food or from drugs or from TikTok or whatever it is that's getting us amped up, we will then have a balancing effect. And usually this is cortisol and a cascade of other things that this author talks about in terms of what happens in our system when we're pummeled by a ton of dopamine. Again, what does this all mean in relation to work? It goes back to the discussion that I've had again and again around what matters and what it means to have a rich life. And I'm not talking money rich, I'm talking like an enriching life. Dopamine dependency, or sometimes what's referred to as compulsive overconsumption of media, food, games, TikTok, whatever it is, it could be getting in the way of us knowing, understanding, and working towards things that really matter. And the things that really matter are going to vary from person to person. But ultimately, this points to values. And most would agree that close human connection is necessary for a meaningful life. So the author points to this, and I agree with this, that it's all around intimate connections, and sometimes distractions and overconsumption of various things can keep us from intimate connections with friends, family, the rest of our lives. And are we putting quick fix pleasure in front of that? This is extreme in some cases in the sense of extreme abuse, but it can also be getting in the way of other things when it comes to work in more subtle ways. I question if we could be measuring our work experience based on a number of cheap hits. If we're so used to getting cheap hits from other things in our lives, do we even have the tolerance to get through and understand what a meaningful or compelling work experience is? Or are we using the cheap dopamine releasing things, food, drink, other distractions, to help get us through what could be really tedious or boring work? Are we being weakened as a society by the abundance of these cheap hits? Some would say yes. Think of older generations looking at the younger ones, saying that the younger ones want pats on the back for a job well done 24/7. That's definitely a dopamine releasing type of event. Some would say that we can't focus on complicated tasks because we have a loss or maybe even an underdevelopment of mental endurance. So what, if anything, do we rely on for focus? I told you before, I relied on candy in college. I relied on diet soda for a lot of years. What do we use to cope? What do we do when we have that slump in the afternoon? How and why do we distract ourselves? Maybe it is for a quick pick-me-up in the middle of something that's tedious or boring. It could be a quick look at social media. Other times it might be the satisfaction of completing something that's quick, like, a quick work task, maybe an email that you know the answer to, you could get that out. And you're doing that instead of something maybe a longer term, more complicated, more tedious project or something like that. Sometimes this isn't a big deal. Sometimes you need it to balance out your day. But other times, if it's really distracting from actual priorities because you're focused on things you can do quickly and that feel quote unquote more satisfying, it might get in the way of getting the other real work that is really meaningful to the organization done. Maybe we distract a colleague when we need a break from something. What do you rely on? Anything to get through? Do you rely on things for that quick fix to get through the times when work just gets uncomfortable for whatever reason? When I was a junior in high school, I attended the graduation ceremony of the grade ahead of me. So they were graduating seniors. I went to a Catholic high school, and Father Moore, who was one of the teachers at the school, was giving the commencement speech. And Father Moore, he was a really special guy. I mean, a side point, he reminded me of Kevin Bacon, who was like one of the heartthrobs at the time, but he was definitely in this Father What a Waste category. He was attractive. He had an appeal to him. He was extremely funny and very wise, and he just had a way about him. He was quirky. Everyone loved him. He actually died in the last couple of years, and what a loss. And the tribute that went out on social media was really something. I remember him back in this graduation speech describing to the high school graduates the difference between what was fun and what brought true happiness. And I think in today's wording, we might instead say something more like fun versus fulfillment or satisfaction. I feel that the more that research has been done on happiness and positive psychology, we realize that a fulfilled or satisfying life acknowledges an experience in a range of emotions. It includes happy, light, fun, but it's not only that. His speech left a mark on me, or did for many, many years. And basically, he was describing that the things that really are the most satisfying, we're probably going to have to work for a little bit. They might have elements of fun, but really what was an enriching life was something quite different. So really, I love the thought that we move towards ideas of enrichment that can include quick fixes and dopamine and distraction, but not completely. I remember my mom, she probably would still say this today, that romance novels were like a junk food equivalent of a book compared to like well-written fiction or some other kind of literature. One was really kind of a cheap, quick hit, fun, that's cool. But the other one felt more satisfying, like a real well-rounded meal, one that's going to get you through, right? In fact, the author of Dopamine Nation talks about her own addiction to romance literature. It's a really interesting book. She goes into the science of all of this, but she also keeps it storytelling. She talks about her clients. She talks about herself. She talks about real addiction, and all of it is real addiction. Even the reliance on the novels, it was getting in the way of her being who she wanted to be in life. It was keeping her up in the middle of the night. It was distracting her completely. She was reading between patients, and some of this is totally acceptable, but she realized at a certain point it was getting in the way of what really, really mattered to her. So I looked up enrichment, and the definition is the action of improving or enhancing the quality or value of something, which is great, right? And if I had a group in front of me, or, I was working in a workshop or something, this is a great question to throw out to the group, just to have them throw back words that occur to them as they think of what is enriching. I believe that enrichment generally involves being stretched in some way, so things don't always feel good. And it's an openness to not knowing something. You might even feel resistance or feel this fear around looking dumb around something that you're being educated about. There could also be recovery involved here when you're going through an enriching experience. You might have to recover just like a muscle would after a good workout. You need that recovery in order to use the muscle again. And if you continue to work hard with that one muscle day after day after day, you're going to damage it eventually. So there needs to be a balance. It all goes back to balance. I believe it also includes this feeling that you have a role, that there's something in it that means that you have a role in something bigger than yourself. The best discussion so far that I came across as it relates to enrichment is from one of my gurus who I've mentioned before, Richard Rudd, who is the author of The Gene Keys. He says that enrichment means to suck the marrow out of life. And I think that's just fantastic. I think that is a fantastic definition. And again, he doesn't necessarily say to avoid distraction, but just be cognizant of the impacts of various types of activity on yourself, on your energy, on your spirit. I've often spoken about engaging in breaks that uplift you or calm you versus those that drain you. So if a conversation with a colleague is going to go down the tubes and be quite negative, maybe that's not the best way to take a break. Or if you can't pull yourself out of social media once you've dipped in, maybe that's not a great way to take a break. I haven't done this in a long time, if I was really feeling stagnant in the middle of the afternoon, especially if working from home, I had this ability, I might stop for 10 or 15 minutes and look at a few YouTube videos of songs that I really like and would sing. Singing is one of the things I love to do, and, kind of rock it out for 5-10 minutes. It can really change your energy, taking a walk, all of these things. So enrichment is something different than entertainment, but I do think that enrichment can include entertainment. And also, my first book, I talked about good drains versus bad drains. And there are these activities that really can feed the human spirit, and there are others that sap it. When I'm presenting in front of an audience, this requires a ton of energy. I am exhausted when I am done, but there's kind of a sweetness in the exhaustion. What I was doing meant something, hopefully, in a larger context. Elite athletes talk about this. Musicians talk about this. They talk about it with relation to their practice and their working out, but also look at the concert and everything that it requires to get through the actual performance. Enrichment also means that you're not a victim to distraction, so it requires that you learn self-discipline, back to self-discipline and the concepts talked about and optimized you, and just ways that we serve ourselves, putting ourselves first sometimes by doing things that are hard in advance. Enrichment means knowing and having control over the option instead of being victim to your senses. It's deciding based on what will enrich you in a moment and what will not. And sometimes a delicious turtle cheesecake will enrich you in a moment, and sometimes it will not. And this was an exact experience. Last Friday, we went out. The husband made a date, which was really nice. And then we went to a bakery on our way to the next little town over. And the cheesecake was absolutely fantastic, and I felt no weirdness about it. Whereas other times I know that it's just not going to serve me. I'm almost using it to get through something that's difficult. This was totally different. It was part of a much better, more complete whole experience. So let's look at the things that happen at work sometimes as it relates to dopamine and potential reliance on this, and also alternatives. What could be more enriching over time? I talked before about maybe engaging with coworkers and negative complaining, something that brings your spirit down. And I have to say, I need sometimes to vent. I think we all need to vent sometimes and get things off our chest that are just things that happen. And sometimes talking through something can actually lead you to something better, which I think is absolutely fantastic. But if it's the same conversation again and again, and just a very victim mindset, and that you have no action control or anything, nothing that you can do, that's not going to help you in the end. There are enriching options when it comes to expressing in more constructive ways. I talked about it in episode 12. We can come to a point of resolve sometimes when we're brainstorming with another person. So I think that's a fantastic approach. Maybe not try to come up with the solution immediately. Sometimes it does just not feel that great right after a negative thing happens at work. But later, maybe taking a positive approach and understanding, where could I take an action, a reaction, or a mindset shift? I actually had something happen yesterday at work that didn't feel good, and there was a lesson for me in it. And I also know that there's a certain part of it that I'm not responsible for, and I am going to move more forward. But again, I know that there's learning, and I know that there's action that I can do, but I also know that I'm not 100% responsible for everything that went into this kind of dissonance that I ended up feeling. I do have some control over my action, my reaction, and my mindset to all of this. I think it could also help to ask a coworker with the same or similar position how they deal with something, and maybe see if you could consider a different approach next time if there is something that really isn't going well in your environment. And if you can't find someone in your company, maybe you could find someone with a similar role in a different company to understand how someone approaches something. This requires a little bit of vulnerability and admitting that you don't know how to do something. Another area here about work, me heading to the convenience shop in the afternoon for candy. And I did do this early years in corporate work. The days were long and I would hit that afternoon slump. And you could either be hitting it because you're just tired. You could be bored with the work. You might just be out of steam when it comes right down to it. So you could go and you could rely on candy, which will help the first time, and it might even help the second time, but eventually doesn't help anymore, and you actually just need the candy in order to get through. It's the same as any other drug. So the self-discipline part in here gets a little bit more extensive, a little bit more involved. Get enough sleep, right? Wow, that's such a simple statement and so hard to actually have happen. Some people have insomnia. A few things that I've done over the years and I know have worked for others is setting your alarm actually in the evening for time to start winding down, start moving towards bedtime. Non-stimulating activity after this time, maybe no phone use after that time, maybe no television after that time. Mapping out foods that are going to serve in a better experience. I've known that protein is huge for me. If I don't have the right amount of protein early in the day, I can just say forget it by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. A lot of human beings want to wind down in the afternoon. And in Europe, God love them, they get to take a break for like 2 or 3 hours if they're in Italy. This is not how the American workforce system is set up, for whatever terrible reason. So, these are things that we have to be, I think, a little bit more intentional about. What are we actually going to consume? Can we take a small break? So the new me, when I'm at my best self and actually like organized, I might take a daily walk. Doing it in the morning, it's amazing how that pays dividends throughout the day. Drinking plenty of water. Oh my God, this is so simple. And lately I heard some guy say, just drink 3 bottles of water a day. And he even said, don't worry about what size the freaking bottle is. Just drink 3 bottles. And usually that's just going to set you up for a good pattern. Have some breakfast. I usually make a shake, although I might be moving away from that at some point. Have a salad for lunch. Have some greens and be prepared with some kind of snack. Things that have worked for me that are a little bit more on the healthy side that don't leave me drained and pummeled. I can have an apple with almond butter. I can have yogurt. Sometimes I actually add protein powder to the yogurt and then fruit with that as well. So those are some things that have worked for me. If you're working from home, I think it's totally reasonable to take a break in the afternoon, 15, 20 minutes, and go lay down. Let yourself close your eyes. It's a perfect time to stick earbuds in and do a meditation app or something, even for 10 minutes. If you drift off for 3 minutes and come back, you'll be a completely different person when you come back. People who drive to work, this has not been me for a very long time, go to your car. Drive it somewhere else to a parking lot where no one finds you. I'm sure that people do this. I've talked to people that do this, and just close your eyes and relax if it's not blazing hot or something where you are. So those are some ideas for that common afternoon slump. And then actual work, you can be in a very reactive mode, like I was saying before, doing the quick hit types of things like, I know how to answer that email. This other project I'm in the middle of is draining the life force out of me right now. So I'm going to just hit all of these quick, easy tasks. It's going to add up to failure at some point. So with actual work, taking the time to prioritize and map out projects and workflows, and then also understanding what maintenance activities you have to do. So most folks, no matter what type of position, usually there are like bigger projects that are going on, and then things that you just have to do on a regular basis. And sometimes those things that you have to do on a regular basis get deprioritized. I hear people don't want to do their expense reports if you don't have an assistant to do it, like most of us, I think. That kind of thing can be deprioritized just because it feels tedious. There are certain things that feel tedious, we deprioritize, and then they become this big, huge issue later on. So how can we just be more thoughtful in advance about how we prioritize and map things out? I find just putting things on paper to be hugely helpful. Actually, that's one of my afternoon things too, if I'm ever feeling, which actually most of the time I feel disoriented. I definitely run out of steam in the afternoon. In the morning, I feel like I can hum along, and then by mid to late afternoon, depending on the day, I feel a little discombobulated. And I do find that scribbling some things down on paper or reviewing what I've done so far can be very helpful in keeping me on track to getting a few more things done before the end of the day. So those are some ideas. I'm curious if anyone does other things to help them get through or stay with it or whatever those things are. I want to just say that the human brain is wired for distraction. It helped us survive as hunter-gatherers. It would be good to be highly conscious if anything could sneak up on you while you were looking for your dinner. So we are wired for this. The human brain is also wired for dopamine. It's posited that humans with more dopamine were actually those that survived longer, or their genes got passed down because those were the ones that were open to exploration, crossing the Bering Strait, all of these things. Definitely that dopamine reward was worth them going for it. Think of these people who do extreme sports. They're very compelled by that hit of dopamine after the rush, and it gets them to do things that a lot of people wouldn't do. And things that a lot of people wouldn't do are the things that create societies and feats of engineering and businesses that no one ever thought of. So we are wired for it. These aren't negative aspects. They're just things that have been pirated or taken advantage of, exploited by those who are selling us things and want control of our money. The combination of these things, access to highly distracting objects and activity in our environments, at the very same time produce these constant cheap hits of dopamine. They really can sap us of our human spirit. Definitely, there's the potential that the quality of experience will be reduced in our lives. We can become numb. We lose vitality. In the book, Dopamine Nation, she talks about pressing on the side of pain. And this doesn't mean in a harmful way, but I talked before about how our systems want to balance. So if we do have a ton of hits of dopamine, we are going to have a flood of opposing things that happen. One of them is cortisol. So how can we press on the side of pain, not in a harmful way, in order to have a better prolonged experience? We need to acknowledge that sometimes the most challenging experiences of our lives bring the most reward. Raising children, I believe, is probably one of the biggest here. And I don't have children, but I can see that. I can see that it is extremely difficult and extremely rewarding to see a child that you've brought up, that you've brought through all the paces of life, and then see them go out and do things in the world. Exercise, of course, falls into this. Exercise is shown to provide slow effects of dopamine release for hours post-activities. Daily walks pay dividends. If you do it a while, you'll be amazed at how the afternoon slump gets a little easier. You feel better once you get into these rhythms and patterns. From her book, Dopamine Nation, she says, in humans, high levels of physical activity in junior high, high school, and early adulthood predict lower levels of drug use. Exercise has also been shown to help those already addicted to stop or cut back. Another thing she talks about are cold plunges. So I'm going to read a little bit about the cold plunge. Using blood samples, the researchers showed that plasma blood dopamine concentrations increased 250% and plasma norepinephrine concentrations increased 530% as a result of cold water immersion. Dopamine rose gradually and steadily over the course of the cold bath and remained elevated for an hour afterward. Norepinephrine rose precipitously in the first 30 minutes, plateaued in the latter 30 minutes, and dropped by about a third in the hour afterward, but it remained elevated well above baseline into the second hour after the bath. Dopamine and norepinephrine levels endured well beyond the painful stimulus itself. So they go on to say that in some cases, the positive effects of dopamine can go on for like 3 or 4 hours. So this is much extended past something that we get from candy. She also talks about, in terms of pressing on the side of pain, radical honesty, and that it can be painful to be honest 100% of the time. And there's also a certain capacity for humans to lie. We think it's going to serve us in some ways, but it does detract from intimacy. And intimacy is its own form of dopamine, and it's linked directly to oxytocin. She writes, intimacy is its own source of dopamine. Oxytocin, a hormone much involved with falling in love, mother-child bonding, and lifetime pair bonding of sexual mates, binds the receptors to the dopamine-secreting neurons of the brain's reward pathway and enhances the firing of the reward circuit tract. In other words, oxytocin leads to an increase in brain dopamine. These are the ways that you can press on the pain, knowing that doing some things that require self-discipline and a little bit of discomfort will actually lead to a better sense of being and a more enriched experience. I think we all get that a little bit of pain is usually involved in working towards something that is compelling. And even in my everyday work life, I might have a question that comes in that feels quite painful that I'm not going to get through. But there is satisfaction in a well-crafted response and a well-crafted product. And there's an extra hit if I actually get a reply from the person that I'm serving within my environment. What's weird, and it's just a human thing, is that I can still have resistance around certain types of things. That initial feeling of, oh, this is going to be hard, I feel resistance towards. And that could be me personally. And not everyone might have that. I do feel, looking around in my work environments, that some people just must love the challenge every time. Or maybe they're just putting on a really good front. I don't know. I know my system seems to want to revert to this protection, which I talked about in previous episodes. I want to protect. I feel a little bit overwhelmed, so I resist. But then I apply. It's my job. I'm going to do it. I'm going to be professional. And then the reward from that, the adult side, me being my true self, comes out. And it's really great. And when I have weeks that are really full of very engaging, compelling activity at work, the weekend is actually more rewarding, more satisfying. The opposite, the relief, the enjoyment, the activities that are on the weekend can have a much more pleasurable feeling or experience because there's been a little bit more challenge during the week. So there's been a lot here talking about dopamine, what it's doing in our systems. Maybe we're relying on it a little bit. Maybe we're relying on things to cope in ways that aren't helping us ultimately. And maybe there are some things that we can put in place, pressing on the side of pain, really just self-discipline, a little bit of prioritizing in order to pre-plan. It's so amazing to me how my day is completely different when I map out how I want it to look. Just the very, very basic activity of doing that puts me in a better state to go to sleep. And it puts me in a better place to have a more compelling, satisfying, rewarding day that includes dopamine, but ultimately can add up to a really enriched life. There you have it. Episode 14 is in the books. I want to say a little bit here. Just understanding this reward chemical pathway of dopamine was really the point of this episode. And not letting it control you or numb you. It's part of life. It's one of the best parts of life. But it's just about understanding and getting ahead of it and not letting it drain you, not being drained by emptier forms of obtaining the dopamine. Back in the day, I learned that singing could bring me a good type of break that left me lifted. And I feel other types of hobbies can do this. The first time I scrapbooked, I was very surprised at how good I felt after. I had done it for several hours and it left me with a good feeling after. I think that all humans could be seeking some kind of activity like this, some kind of hobby or some kind of respite. And maybe even there's something in your work that you could lean into that leaves you lifted, that feels like it's the right thing for you to be doing. I'm not sure that everything in everyone's work description, whether they're solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, or if you just have a regular job, I don't think that the entire thing is meant to be full of dopamine. I think that there are things that are going to draw you to what you're meant to do, and they're not always going to feel awesome. There's really a balance here. It seems that our system, our world, our planet, all of it is based on the need to balance, to understand the various dynamics and the different poles that draw you in one direction or the other. I'd really like to leave us with this idea around seeking and curating an enriched experience of work and life. And really, it occurs to me that that's what this podcast is all about. It's about curating an enriched experience of work and, of course, of life, because the themes transmit that you can't separate them. As always, please send any comments or messages my way. You can even record a message on an app on your phone. Perhaps you have a recording app on your phone. Attach it to an email and send it to linda@workdopepod.com. That's linda@workdopepod.com. Until next time, this is Linda Stacy signing off for Work Dope. I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.